Mandatory disclosures and their use for addressing risks, particularly in the climate sector, is something that has been coming along. It's been informed by the fact that there's needed to be risk disclosure for as long as investments existed, and whether you got it from somebody sitting across the button or under the buttonwood tree in the New York, which is where the New York Stock Exchange was born, or whether you're getting it over your computer. As an investor, you need information to assess both the risks of your investments and the opportunities. To do that and to have capital flow efficiently, there's got to be trust. And having a government require or create statutes that set out standards that then they can enforce brings trust to the marketplace, and it makes it easier for capital to flow. And so that's why there's particularly in addressing climate risks that are now crystallizing, there's a new emphasis on taking what had been voluntary standards developed by industry experts and also with input from climate scientists and others to try and get information that can be trusted out to investors so that capital can flow to address some of the challenges that we face as a result of the climate crisis. There are a lot of stakeholders in this space, and but they do bring all something very important. We have public companies that are delivering goods and services to their customers. We have investors, whether it's pension funds who've got time frames that may be longer than other investors, public investors, which may be in terms of equity markets or even debt markets. And at least from one perspective that I'm most familiar with, the idea is to not be the decision maker for the investor, but instead be the enabler for a system that's robust, ensuring consistent and comparable disclosures. Now, you do get that through different other stakeholders, such as the folks who are auditors or accountants or people providing assurances about those statements, the folks who are maybe contracted out to account for the scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions that need to be reported. So I think government can take the voluntary standards, they can develop what then become the baseline for the rules of the road. Having that be established creates, again, reduces friction, helps create more trust, which helps capital flow to the places where it may be most needed and can be most impactful. At the end of the day, when you are talking about disclosures and trust, though, you do need a mechanism for enforcement. And that can come through several different mechanisms, whether it's through administrative structure that a country may set up, whether it's a joint effort where you have securities or disclosure authorities who can police the marketplace and/or can work also with criminal officials. Obviously, you hope that doesn't have to get to that, but knowing that there's in effect a risk for not properly disclosing your risk can be a big incentive to make the system work. In terms of what government should consider, that I think is pretty basic. It's a robust and transparent process that facilitates the ability of stakeholders to present their views, and for there to be clear rules and understandable rules of the road that are then made available to all the different stakeholders and bringing them into understanding this. Depending on the nature and maturity level, the particular markets or the countries where their infrastructures are, this is going to vary, and it should certainly tailor to the local circumstances if it's going to be effective. Perspective I mostly have is with big complex markets where there basically is a whole separate set of rules, statutory framework for how long you may need to have a big proposal out for comment. I think there's more and more an effort, even in the age of technology, to try and meet people where they are. And I think also in particularly countries with big geographic space, having a way for people to be able to use what's available with technology, but then also going out and being able to do face-to-face communications with the local communities, and to be able to take that back so you're not operating in a silo and can better inform the process, I think is really critical, so that when the end comes, it's not going to please everybody. There's going to have to be compromise, but it's much easier to sell that compromise and have it be effective if you've had a transparent, open time frame process for getting the comments in. Every country, in terms of developing what's going to be best for it, you have to take into account national and cultural circumstances. This can create a diversity of approach. It may be some communities or countries are small, and the understanding is such that in the fabric of the culture, that you may not need sort of a full-blown prosecutorial regime like you may see in a number of advanced or Commonwealth countries. But for sort of effectively enforcing it, again, being clear on the rules of the road and explaining what the penalties and knowing what you're trying to do when you would want to improve behavior, and having flexible tools for dealing with that are important. The idea really in the sort of the climate financial regulatory disclosure space is have a point of departure that people can agree to. Different countries, as I said, will have different stakeholders that may have the authority to either get accountants to conform with things. That may be something that's a voluntary organization or done at a self-regulatory level with government oversight. It may well be, if it's a small or emerging market, if all the accounting and sort of audit and assurance experience is with the people who sort of run the government budget, then if that's what's appropriate for enforcement and will be the best fit for that country, that should be the case. So I think particularly on enforcement, you've got to take into account the local and national circumstances, but having the common baseline will sort of help weave together better global approach and cross-border capital flows that can help address climate crisis. If the rules of the road have become clear enough and you're well informed enough and you've got agreement with stakeholders on going forward and need to make something mandatory, one of the key things to realize is that you're taking a snapshot of a moment in time with the best available information that you have. And particularly, as we know, with respect to climate change, things change quickly. They can change unexpectedly. You don't want to be in a position where 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years, even after you've come up with an approach, that it becomes outdated. So one of the ways to both make sure you're addressing risks and opportunities that come along the way is to develop a toolkit that allows you to provide flexibility when new issues come up. One kind of track where we see that occurs is if you have a particular rule about disclosures of a particular sort, and it's working well, looks like you're getting good compliance, you're going in and sort of inspecting the disclosures and overseeing the auditors and reviewing the statements that come in, but there's some new technological development or maybe even some change in ecology that sort of shifts the dynamic, to provide yourself to be able to take some baby steps to assess whether that is going to become the new normal. So having some sort of process where you can provide people with regulatory flexibility and be able to assess whether or not the goalposts do need to be changed as a result of these developments. So regulatory flexibility, requiring, it could be costly to go back and revisit the whole landscape every 2 years. That may not be what you want to do, but you can run pilot programs on with respect to different issues, and for others having sunsets on different provisions or requiring reports and being able to go out and stock take of the stakeholders involved as to whether the policies are effective, so that it's an iterative process. It is not a one and done. Fortunately or unfortunately, it's going to be very complex, and there are going to be people who will want to game the system, and so I think you need to maintain your vigilance throughout, but try and build in some tools, provisions in law, cultural approaches, whatever works that allows for you to adapt along the way. How we ended up getting to the point where we're considering, tipping point in effect on mandatory disclosures, in this area has been very interesting, particularly from a financial market perspective. A lot of the regulatory framework that we have in place has been crisis driven by events in the financial markets that have affected either the banking markets or the capital markets, and are designed, in some effect to, catch the horse out of the barn, and with whatever foresight you may have, prevent the same or something similar from mutating, in the financial markets. What's been, I think, particularly interesting and challenging in climate change is because of its the origins of grassroots campaigning and citizen-pushed, citizen-led efforts in this regard, and the fact that it has taken, unfortunately, too long for the immediacy of the issue to move onto the agendas of the governments. It's become clear that really for the governments to be able to deliver, and again, from a financial standpoint, again, having disclosures, not being merit regulators, making sure that investors, users, preparers know what the rules of the road are without sort of supplanting the investor decision-making process. To have that be done in a way that investors get information that is comparable and consistent in this day and age requires government intervention, and to have a baseline of standards where at least representatives of those governments in some form or another can sort of bring their best talents together. While there be a lot of well-intentioned people out there who could probably help deliver most of this, the risks are too great, and the pitfalls will be borne, in this case, by all of humanity, if these things are not undertaken with sufficient rigor. And that at this juncture requires government framework. I had mentioned before, particularly the importance of enforcement that would need to be government administered. That is not to say that along the way, the role that different grassroots campaigns, the role that different subsectors of the financial industry have played, whether it's developing investment vehicles or assurances, you need the voluntary participation and expertise of these stakeholders. But at the end of the day, for it to really truly have meaning and be binding, you need a mandatory regime to come into place. When you've got consistency of disclosures, and you know that they're going to be enforced, and again, at a national level, there is no, yet global police force. It takes, again, it helps reinforce the trust element that you need in markets for capital to flow. And when you have that, you are taking friction out of the process. You are reducing the costs for information gathering that investors have to do. You are leveling the playing field for all the different sectors participants, and these are suppliers, they are investors. It's across the entire stakeholder chain to have a common language and understanding of what a particular company's position may be, both the risk that it may face and the opportunities that it's pursuing. And when you can break down the barriers to trust, it is much easier for hopefully the capital to flow and to be directed to a good and efficient use in helping to address issues that can combat the effects of climate change. One of the things that has become crystal clear, and this is, I think, particularly on the opportunity side, with the types of incentives that different governments are offering, whether you call them, subsidies or other sort of outright grants to promote renewable developments, you have to break down silos for that to be effective, both for the opportunity and the risks. Particularly with the advent of these major policy developments in the United States, in Europe, things that could be delivered through what is coming through renewed funding via the multilateral development banks, that being able to bring together the climate experts along with the finance experts to try and create a level playing field is very critical. You hear it, I think most often come up with respect to what type of permitting is needed to achieve certain things. I mean, investors may have one time frame that they're aiming for, and whether or not the person who's in charge of environmental regulations and emissions has any understanding as to what may be, driving the investor's interests or needs or demand for information, it can be a difficult crosswalk. But I think that's probably one of the most effective things. And we're seeing it, at least in the US, play out in real time with the adoption of the Inflation Reduction Act and the type of interactions and disclosures, because you may have different regulatory authorities requiring different types of disclosures, trying to find a way to reduce duplication and understand one another so that you don't have one particular sector or key that unlocks an administrative procedure, blocking the ability to make progress to the overall long-term goals or project. Will depend sort of on what your objective and what your system is. If it is building some sort of complex renewable site, you need to think about what remit you have as the regulator for the space. Is it the land use? Is it some other public utility related thing? If it's something that is being done by, say, for example, a company that's publicly traded, to getting a sense of what they are going to have to disclose or thinking about disclosing to investors. And if you're, for example, going to set deadlines, you're going to set certain investor expectations, and a realization that the truth is going to win out the day, and that it's a collective project. If you're having all these different, investor stakeholders, people whose land use is being involved, the permitting. I'm not saying that you need that for every single project in the financial perspective, and it's driven on what is material information to investors, and so not every granular piece of a project is going to fall into that category. But at least when the rules are being set for what are going to be the rules for the disclosures, and you've got a specific impacted community, it makes sense to try and get as broad an input overall. I mean, typically the way officials deal with that is by having a very wide open public comment process. And then you go back and review them. And we'll take from there the information that people have given you to see what you need to follow up on. Was there a segment of stakeholders that you had not realized was impacted? Are you the proper authority to deal with them, or is there some other government authority? And then again, building the bridges that they need to take their toolkit to address that problem, and explaining to them how doing so will help benefit a project that's got a number of different puzzle pieces to it.